The Jeep Grand Cherokee was already a handsome beast in a square-jawed kind of way, but last year Jeep took the time to tweak the design and fiddle with the oily bits. The trademark 7-slot grille is now shorter, while the lower grille section has been revised and changes slightly with each of the 5 model grades. The headlights are now slimmer and feature both xenon lighting and LED running lights across the range. At the rear, the tail lights are now larger and use LED illumination, the bumpers have been tweaked, the spoiler's larger and the tailgate offers greater visibility. Some of the materials used in the interior are said to have been increased in quality, and our top-spec Summit model features an appealing suede-like finish for the A-pillars and the roof. The electrically adjustable seats and steering wheel both offer good adjustment, and it's certainly a very spacious interior, particularly in terms of elbow room. While it's nice to see Jeep get away from that shiny fake wood that we're used to, it's a shame that most of the silver trim is still painted plastic. And while we're nagging, the pedal for the parking brake feels old-fashioned now that most cars of this type are moving to electronic versions, and the pedal digs into your leg if you try to use the footrest. Also new are the instruments, which use a 7-inch colour screen for the central display that can be configured to show a range of different information. New too is the 8.4-inch colour touchscreen for the Uconnect system that lives in the centre stack. The system looks after audio, climate, navigation, connectivity and vehicle settings, and while it's generally all very easy to use, the navigation system is a bit clunky both in operation and in terms of its route guidance. The big change for 2014, however, was the arrival of a new 8-speed automatic transmission. We'll talk about what it's like on the road later, but for now we'll say that we're not fans of the new shift lever, mainly because it demands you press the button to move between modes more than a conventional auto would, but also because it lacks a Tiptronic function. Instead, to change gears you have to use one of the steering wheel mounted paddles, but these we found to be a touch too small and mounted a little too high up. Mounted by the gear lever are the controls for the air suspension that's standard on Overland and Summit models, and this allows you to cycle between an entry mode that makes it easy to get in and out, a normal ride height mode, plus 2 off-road modes, with the highest offering an additional 6.6 cm over the normal setting, and that's a total of 28 cm of ground clearance. There's also an aero mode that lowers the suspension by 1.3 cm to improve aerodynamics, and this engages automatically at speed. Next to the suspension controls is Jeep's answer to Land Rover's terrain response system. Dubbed Select Terrain, it offers auto, snow, sand, mud and rock modes, with each altering the responses of the transmission, engine, suspension and other systems. Rock mode only engages with low range selected, and that can only be done with the transmission in neutral, but we'll talk more about that stuff later. Rear seat passengers are well looked after with their own ventilation and USB ports, as well as good head and leg room and enough space in the footwells for a middle seat passenger to travel comfortably. The seats also recline for greater comfort on longer journeys, and they fold forward to form an almost flat load floor. However, there's no 7-seat option as there is in a Land Rover Discovery. A power tailgate is standard on all but the entry-level Laredo model, and once you get into the boot there's 782 litres of space on offer. The boot floor is quite high, largely because there's a full-size spare, but there's still acres of space, with a maximum of 1,554 litres with the seats folded. There are several neat touches back here, such as a rechargeable torch, 12-volt charging points, and more load hooks than you could ever need. Although a monstrous 6.4-litre V8-powered SRT model is available, realistically there's only one engine in the UK, and that's the 3-litre V6 turbo diesel. It produces a pretty handy 250 horsepower and 570 Nm of torque, although in the entry-level model Jeep have chosen to artificially detune it to 190 horsepower, a move we think is a mistake. On the move it's really very capable. There's some initial resistance as you pull away from standstill, but it's generally only something you notice when you make a quick getaway. For instance, floor the throttle and there's a delay of a good second or two while everything gathers itself together before there's a chirp from the tyres and you're propelled down the road. In normal driving though, things are much smoother, the new 8-speed transmission doing an excellent job of blending one ratio into the next and responding well to kickdown. It rides well too, with large surface imperfections dealt with without fuss, although in common with other air suspension setups, at lower speeds around town there is a slight tendency to fidget about. The Grand hustles itself through corners well for such a big car, and what feels like body roll is probably just you sliding in your seat. The big Jeep could use a bit more side bolstering here. Jeep have done an excellent job of controlling wind and road noise, making the Grand Cherokee an excellent long-distance cruiser. Jeep claims the Grand can achieve 37.7 mpg on a combined cycle, and while we couldn't achieve that, we averaged around 30 mpg across a mix of driving conditions. CO2 emissions of 198 grams per kilometre place it in Band J, but curiously the figures for the crippled Laredo version are identical, removing any possible benefit. Of course, as with any Jeep, its on-road performance is only half the story. Laredo and Limited models make do with standard steel suspension, the more expensive Quadralift air system reserved for the Overland and Summit models. This limits the ground clearance of the two entry-level models to 21 cm versus the 28 cm of a Summit test model. Jeep quotes an official wading depth of just over 50 cm, which is surprisingly low given the air intake's location above and behind the near side headlight. However, Jeep remains one of the few companies not to have moved exclusively to the new breed of brake-based four-wheel drive systems. Laredo and Limited models feature the company's Quadratrack 2 system, and this does use the brakes to stop a spinning wheel and transfer power to the opposite wheel, while a centre differential can route up to 100% of available torque to the axle with the most traction. In low range, the transfer case splits torque equally 50-50 between front and rear. Overland and Summit models, however, are better equipped, featuring instead the Quadra-Drive 2 system that incorporates an electronic rear differential that can proactively direct torque to the wheel with the most traction, while the centre diff and the transfer case distributes torque front to rear as necessary. Realistically, either system will take you to most places you want to go to in a vehicle of this size and value, but if you wanted to increase its performance, we'd suggest a change of tyre should be your first item of business. Prices for the Grand Cherokee start at £37,705 for the Laredo, but given its restricted engine and cloth seats, we think that's a tough sell. More usefully spec'd, however, is the Limited at £39,165, with our fully loaded Summit model weighing in at a hefty £50,205. The problem for the Grand Cherokee, though, is its residuals. At these prices, a Land Rover Discovery with its bulletproof resale value becomes the more sensible choice. That aside, however, there's a lot to like about the Grand Cherokee. It's more capable than its size would suggest both on and off-road, and its handsomely rugged styling is likely to win it more than a few fans.